So continuing with the previous lecture about generalities of oil, or what we call basics of oil, today we're going to talk about, in particular, of the oil and gas hydrocarbons, but in Latin America. All right. So that's we're going to go over a few numbers first about generalities, and then we're going to take most of the five leading countries producing oil in Latin America today. So as you see here, the provinces, we call it in that way, sedimentary basins are marked in red here. These are places where we have an accumulation of sedimentary rocks proper enough to be holding hydrocarbons in there. So we see here for North America, except Mexico. I should make a point that Mexico, Mesoamerica, more than likely is known in these places. It's only South and Caribbean, South American and Caribbean. So we see Cuba with some deposits in the north face of the island. Not really very important, but we're gonna see them in a quick way. And then we see the basins in Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, which is partially offshore, some of the important basins in Venezuela, then Guyana, Suriname, Amazon in Brazil, and then the offshore basins in Brazil, which are very, very important nowadays for Brazilian economy in particular, since they are actually the key to become independent in the source of hydrocarbons for a country that didn't have any not too long ago. So we see Sergipe, Lagoas Basin, Campos Basin, Santos, and Pelotas Basin here. And then as we go far south central part of South America, we see Santa Cruz, Tarija Basin, Neuquén Basin in Argentina, San Jorge Basin in Argentina too, and then the Magallanes Basin, also called the Austral Basin in Argentina mostly, part in Chile, but mostly in Argentina. So we're going to go into that and talking a little about what happened in Mesoamerica later. So what we see here is the main places where we have oil and gas fields marked with this blue dot. We see all these coastal areas in Brazil. So Brazilian production is mostly offshore and sometimes in quite deep water. Venezuela, basins and fields. In Colombia, some here in Ecuador, you see obviously here in Tarija Basin, in Bolivia, Argentina, Neuquén Basin, a very important one, we're going to talk about that later, San Jorge, and Magellan or Austral Basin. Now, in Mesoamerica is highly related to the Gulf section here. Gulf of Mexico, we see the important basin of the North Gulf of Mexico. This including Texas, Louisiana, and part of Florida, at least in part. And then we see the continuation in Tampico Misantla Basin in Mexico, Villahermosa, Veracruz Basin in the Gulf Coast of Mexico. Important to point out there is nothing in the Pacific Central part. So this area here, being a highly volcanic section, is not really prone to develop basins for hydrocarbons. But all the east is very important. Now, Latin America as a producer of crude oil or natural gas, liquid petroleum, and other liquids, those are valued from 2020, is important for the region. And in particular, we see now that Mexico is about 23% of the whole region. Brazil, remarkably enough, is 44%. Colombia is about 9%. And then it goes into minor values in here Argentina 7%, which is more or less in the value that's been historically. And then we see also price Venezuela now 6%. This is a history we're going to talk about. Venezuela used to be a major producer of oil and still one of the more abundant reserves of oil in the world, I should say, and yet it produces a very little liquid hydrocarbons. You see, there is a whole bunch of them that are below 6%. Ecuador, interestingly enough, used to be part or is part of the OPEC. But all the others, Peru, Trinidad, Tobago, Guyana, and even less, Cuba, Bolivia, and so, they produce below 1%. So those are values from 2020, obviously. So looking into the past in here, 2001, past 20 years, we see Mexico leading with a production in million barrels per day of 3,590, followed quite close by Venezuela, then Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and Ecuador. We're going to emphasize these 5 countries. Let's see how the evolution goes. This is 2018, 19, and 20, and we see Brazil keep more or less in the same value, high. Mexico decrease, Colombia increase or keep more or less in the same value. Argentina keeps more or less in the same value. But Venezuela, since 2018, is in the order of 530 million barrels per day. It used to be 3,000. So it's a big change in lowering the production. Big deal. We're going to talk about that a little, and because it's essentially a political situation with Venezuela. So the way it is today is like we see here in 2020. Brazil, 44%, Mexico, 23%. And see, Brazil used to be the third producer in just 20 years ago. Now, looking into the whole world, we see the top 5 producing countries between the 80s, 1980s, and 2020 in million barrels per day. We see here United States with a remarkably increase, about double of increase in the last 15 years or so. This is, as we talked last time, is due to technology. In particular, the advancement of fracking and the revival of many fields that used to be more or less exhausted. Now, the things are up and running quite well. We see here, we see Russia. Where is it? Russia used to be like this, interrupted. This is Russia. This is the Union of Soviet Republics lapsed for a moment and then returned Russia. And see Canada still increasing more or less like the American production did. And that's an interesting point, especially about the new technology. Now, what we get from other countries. This is something we are always worried since it happened, the crisis of 1973. We see most of the oil that we import, and not really much we import today, luckily, but see most of it is coming from Canada, 11% is coming from Mexico, and 4% is coming from Colombia. Russia, according to the circumstances that we have today, almost zero. We don't buy anything from Russia. Only 7% of Saudi Arabia, even less nowadays. So this is something interesting because we are more or less independent of this international market, other than the price. But all production, almost all production, is inside the country. Obviously, we need to buy a few particular oils because the characteristics, they happen to be light enough to be desirable in order to mix and match. But in fact, Latin America, the most important countries for us, according to this graphic here, is Mexico, followed by Colombia, and we're going to go into that order. So Mexico it does produce about 5,822. This is in billion BTU, which is a British thermal unit. 3,412 British thermal unit, equivalent to 1 kilowatt. This is an attempt to make all uniform with all kinds of energy, producing all different kinds, produce it into a unit that is more or less standard. Even so, it's a little different to use for some of us more familiar with kilowatt hour. But anyway, the point here is Mexico is producing only 5,800 and is consuming 8,072. So obviously got a deficit. Got to buy energy from other places. Most of the energy is coming from oil. It's producing almost all the oil, but it's not producing all the gas. So obviously the deficit in here got to be coming from somewhere. And it's a little here too. So Mexico is a major producer of petroleum and other liquids. Production of oil been declining, and this is something we're going to show mostly in the next slide here. See, production of oil in Mexico is right here. So this is production, and this is consumption. So right now is passing the point of equal production consumption, and is reaching a negative point, so they had to buy. Mexico produced an average of 1.9 million barrels per day, but it's declining. So that's one of the reasons Mexico lose the leading point it used to have in Latin American production. Now, gas is even worse. Natural gas consumption is much more than the production, about 2 times more than what is produced. So that's a concern for Mexico. The other concern is the only place where they can buy gas is either United States or bringing it as a liquid in shipments from other places. So the main place where Mexico produce happens to be in this area here, in the area of the coastal north area. Got a production of gas, a little bit of oil, and then in the central part, where it's called the Golden Lane here, oil is 1%, 18%, gas 39%, and then in the central south part of the Gulf of Mexico is some interesting gas in here, probably going to be helping to make up all those poor productions. These are the numbers from, this is actually coming from the U.S. Geological Survey. You see all these different provinces are different areas with a similar geology. Unique petroleum system. Petroleum system normally is defined as the source, and then the reservoir, and such. So normally each one of these got a particular set of conditions. So Mexico. Mexico is playing a really interesting role in the history of the usage of oil in history. Mexico used to have the underground resources under property of the owner of the land, very much like here. So what happened is many people went into Mexico buying land and making bigger profits during this time in the very late part of the 1800s, early part of the 1900s, so much that actually things were getting out of control. And Mexico reacted by passing a law making the oil in the land property of the state, not from the landowners. So what we normally call nationalization. today. Um, so all those properties, all these oil production wells were nationalized by Mexico. So here we have one interesting picture coming from National Geographic in 1920. Very rudimentary rig in here. It's called the Cerro Azul number 4, gushing out under their own pressure. So that was the idea in those days, to go back to Mexico, down to Mexico, and make a good profit buying and selling land with the property of the oil. And one of those was the Golier. The Golier, Everett Lee de Golier, he was born in Kansas, but moving to Oklahoma, and then into Texas, Dallas, Texas, where he make a good fortune as a geologist, as an investor in the oil fields. He was a very renowned petroleum geologist in the world, and still is a company called the Golier today in Dallas, and he is right here, sitting on the porch in Tampico. Interesting enough for us, the Golier got a connection to UTD. The Golier was the one that founded the Geophysical Service Incorporated here. And this Geophysical Service Incorporated got several engineers and geophysicists, McDermott and some others, Clarence. They come over and work in the company making seismic lines. So the GSI was a seismic profiling company. Finally, de Golier sold the company to these two founders. We call it the founders because they are actually the one that found UTD later. And the Geophysical Service Incorporated somewhat produced the Texas Instrument in the early 50s because they need to produce new techniques, they need to produce a new hardware, and they were hiring more and more people to come over and work for them. And that's the way they were making the new company. GSI founder here, we see here Johnson, McDermott, Green, and Peacock, which is now part of UTD. In any case, they were in TI, were working in getting more and more talent to work for them. So they decided to establish a center for research and studies. It's the so-called Graduate Research Center of the Southwest, also named later as SCA, US. And that is what became UTD in 1969. So, in a way, the richness of the fields in Mexico were generating a set of events that come to produce Texas Instrument and then UTD. The Golier got a very colorful, interesting history. It's nice to read how much was done during those years. He worked for the Petroleum Administration during the war, obviously. What else? He was director of the American Petroleum Institute for a long time. And finally he died in 1956. Here is his tombstone in there. Something you can visit and really easy trip right there in Garland Road is the Arboretum today, Dallas Arboretum. That is his place. It used to be a big area with a beautiful house and everything is kept very much when in the same way when he was alive. So the library is a very interesting place too. You got a chance. So it's a little detour through the memory lane here for UTD, but you know. Now, the whole thing stopped. All these quick fortunes with the nationalization of the oil industry in Mexico. Um, so they modify the constitution and make the oil one of the most important assets of the nation. So very much at the same time, there were also passed labor laws that were in a important demand of the oil workers. And by 1938, it was fully nationalized. President Cardenas, and here we have an historical picture of that moment, was proclaiming the expropriation of all the oil from Mexico in that particular day. And it happened to be something very dear to the Mexicans today, as they put it everywhere they can. So we see the event of the Petróleo Mexicano in the stamps, Pemex anniversary here in the coins, different kinds of coins, Petróleo Mexicano or Pemex, which is called today. It's a rather conspicuous industry in Mexico. In fact, if you're going to get oil in Mexico, you want to get anything other than Pemex. That's it. It's everywhere. So the company is a state company, is everywhere, provides fuel and gas to everyone. And it used to be a very important cash cow for the government. In fact, about 1/3 of the fiscal revenues of the country was coming from Pemex, about 60% of the revenue. Those things are changing. So privatization is something quite interesting in Latin America because it happened very much everywhere. We got several different flavors of privatization and nationalization because we do go from nationalization to privatization and back again, like we see here. Argentina is one of those pendular countries that go from full nationalization. Everything was owned by the state. It went all the way to be a private company sold for profit in a way. And then it was bought again very recently in 2012 by the president in that moment, Cristina Fernandez. So she did pay $5 billion compensation to Repsol, which interestingly enough, Repsol is a company from Spain. So all these things are kind of funny in a way. Mexico didn't budge, being nationally owned ever since, and it's a little more flexible into allowing foreign investors to come into work with them, association with Pemex. Yeah. So, question is, will Pemex be privatized? Oh, we don't really know, but you know, everything is up for grabs. One other country we're going to talk about is Venezuela. Venezuela, the name is interesting. It's somewhat mentioned that was Christopher Columbus when he came over and called it Venezuela as meaning a little Venice, like a Venice in Italy, because the area where they arrived was very much in stilts. The population did some houses on stilts over the water. So, but the name is stick and still there. It's a fairly large country. It's the sixth largest country in South America. It's about twice the size of California. We like to compare with something familiar for us. It does border with Brazil, obviously, with Colombia, and with Guyana over here. It's essentially a Caribbean country. The coastal area here is all through the Caribbean Sea. May actually, if you want to limit the Caribbean to this area here, it's also in part Atlantic, but in general, Caribbean is quite well. Uh, anyway, Venezuela primary energy in quadrillion BTU, say 4,000, about 5,000 um, BTU. Consumption, way less. This is 2018, all right? It's a controversial analysis. It used to be a very large producer. It was part of the beginning of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, better known as OPEC, in the 60s. And now Venezuela fell to the fourth, smaller producer in the OPEC member, and declining from that. Main reason is no investment into new drilling, new infrastructure, so the production is just a relictual event from all producing wells. There's a lot of oil in Venezuela, and part of this in Colombia. See here the Maracaibo Basin goes into the middle of Magdalena. This is Colombia here. Llanos Basin is part Colombia, and then the East Venezuela is a very important basin. As a reserve, 220, we do see Venezuela 303 billion barrels of proved oil reserves, the largest in the world. The thing is, it's very difficult to drill for this oil. The oil tends to be very heavy, hard to pump, and difficult to move. On top of being very rich in sulfur, and sulfur in a way, sulfuric acid, which is rather toxic. So here, Venezuela, I can actually talk about the central part in here. This area is a high plateau, the Guyana Plateau, Guyana Highlands, and then we have the basin of the Orinoco going into the Atlantic Caribbean, and then we have the Maracaibo Lake area. So, the climate, Venezuela is a tropical country. Very little seasonal events. They got a dry season from December to April, and a rainy season from May to November. So very much like a typical tropical country. Venezuela still, even with this low production, depends on the petroleum production for the GDP. 1/3 of the GDP is coming from this oil production. Venezuela traditionally is one of the most important countries. In 1921 was a very large production, and generally was the provider for Britain's large hunger for large consumption of oil, especially during the war. In 1939, Venezuela was producing 137 million barrels, making it second only to the United States. In that time, was the leading producer. It was mostly exploited by the Royal Dutch or Shell, largest production in the world. So Venezuela got a lot of oil. Very much it was a mono producer country. Everything was dependent of oil, and in fact it was a preoccupation of the government in Venezuela and many other countries that the oscillation in price in the oil was affecting their countries so much that they want to have some kind of control. So in that respect, Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso, a Venezuelan minister, and Abdullah al-Tariki, another minister, but this one from Saudi Arabia, got together and make out for the beginning of the Organization of Petroleum Producers. So the OPEC was born from these two particular ministers. Right here we have them. Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso and Abdullah al-Tariki. Both of them got a connection with the UT system. Abdullah al-Tariki was living in the United States. He worked in his degree in the University of Texas. And Pérez Alfonso was actually a medicine major in Johns Hopkins University. So they took as a model the Texas Railroad Commission regulation for oil production in order to make it worldwide. So it's a rather interesting and colorful history in the origins of the OPEC, and rightly so. You happen to be interested. It's a rather interesting book, a little old already, 1991, called The Price by Daniel Yergin. So, you got a chance, read it. It's a really easy book to read. The original members of the OPEC were Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. That's it. And then there were some expansions later. OPEC is not what it used to be in the power they got over the oil price, but in general still an important set of players in the regulation of oil price, if we can call it a regulation, because it seems to be wide. Well, enough about the OPEC. We're going to move a little more into Venezuela. Venezuela nationalized its oil much more recently than Mexico. They did it in 1975 to 76, creating PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela, es Sociedad Anónima in Spanish. Anónima. And the country did get all the oil under his particular legislation. So PDVSA is one of the largest oil companies today, and see, the privatization of PDVSA is essentially requiring a change in the constitution of the country. Citgo, that used to be a very important gas company around here, is in part property of PDVSA. So now, politics in this oil, in particular in this country, Venezuela, was affected greatly by this event that we have here. So we have here a series of events in 1997 all the way to 2020, more or less what the statistics we have today. The production in Venezuela was declining rapidly, as we see here, after lacking investment in the infrastructure. So there was a coup by Hugo Chavez, and a new hydrocarbon law took over, increased the production for a moment, and then things start to go down, particularly in the moment here where the oil workers make a strike, serious strike. They were not really working at all. So what happened is Venezuela, in fact, fired everybody. Chavez fired everybody, and the company started declining. The production, which is here, is declining rapidly. Chavez died, succeeded by Nicolas Maduro, another member of his group. In fact, it's a tyranny right now in Venezuela. And the operations are going even worse, and decreasing to this level right now where the amount of oil is being produced in Venezuela is below 1 million barrels per day, a level never reached before. All that is together with a set of sanctions, the living of the oil workers that are very much everywhere in the world now, working in other companies, and the production of Venezuela oil is less than 1/3 what it used to be, and the country is losing a lot of revenue in those years. So we have here something else, 1,000 barrels per day, and here we see number of active drillings, rigs, and see, same thing. You see production continuously decline, and sometimes sharply, like this, to this point in here. So it's rather an example in what should not be done in an oil-producing country. Now, we saw just a sad example of what happened with mismanagement of the resource. Now we're going to see an example of what happened when the resource is well administered, and that is Brazil. Brazil used to have no oil whatsoever. In fact, Brazil was one of the first countries to start using alcohol to run their cars. So they were producing sugar cane to refine the sugar into alcohol and then use it to move the transportation in the country. But later that thing was changed because there were big fields offshore of Brazil, and that is making Brazil one of the primary producers now in Latin America. So that's an example about successful policies and a good management of the resources. See, Brazil today, this is 2018 actually, is producing 6,174 and is consuming only 6,118. So it's something left to sell somewhere. So Brazil economy is also doing well. It's the 8th largest producer in the world in 2019. So economic growth in Brazil is coming along too. Really a good example of what it should be done. Not really easy, because, as I mentioned, making production out of these fields is very difficult. New technology and all that and got to be developed, much more expensive. Now, Brazil got about 12.7 billion barrels of proved oil reserves. It happened to be the second largest oil reserves in South America after Venezuela. Right here, this is the point opposite of what happened in Mexico, opposite to what happened in many countries. Consumption, more or less in the same way, and production is giving us a surplus in here. Good thing. Now, this is the condition where the Brazilian oil is produced. Deep water. Normally, these water are in the order of in the excess of 1,000 meters. And they've been producing for areas where they have 4,000 meters of water. So this is something. Petrobras is the company that works, is also a national oil company. It does own 51% of the resource, and they do produce effectively, making the country rich. So the leading countries producing crude oil in Latin America in 2020 is like this: Brazil, Venezuela went down, Brazil that went up, Mexico went down, Colombia, Argentina more or less the same value, Ecuador is going a little higher as Peru, but they're minor players. Most of the oil is coming from those very deep water. And the oil is heavy too, so that's another thing. Oops. These are the main basins. Espiritu Santo, Campos, by far the best. Santos, probably Pelotas is kind of good. But then we have a few others in here, Foz of Amazon basins, Barreirinhas. These things are offshore, all of them. There are some basins in the Amazon, but they prove not to be even close to that. Campos, most important one. So again, over 80% of this production happens in Campos. And see, this is Campos is right here, and this is a blow up of Campos. As we see here, it's taking the name of this locality here. This is onshore, the shelf right here. You know, the shelf is no deeper than 400 meters at the most. The break of the shelf here, and then the abyssal plain right here in blue. So these things are working all the way into the abyssal plain here, and all the way into the break of the shelf, and on the shelf, of course. Producing in this area here is not too difficult. Producing in this area here, it is very difficult. Again, meters. This is 100 meters, 500 meters, 1,000 meters, and this is 2,000 meters and deeper. No, for 2,000 meters. 80% of Brazilian oil comes from this place. So you can imagine they develop and buy all the possible technology to do things better. They even have this production tankers. The only thing they do is stay there and collect all the oil and even send it to the onshore location after separation of the gas and liquids, and keep going. Production offshore. But it's difficult, very difficult. This is one of these drilling rigs, semi-floating rig, sinking in 2001. So 10 people die and all that. It's a very dangerous work. In Argentina, another country that produced some oil in South America, was the largest dry gas produced in 2016 and the fourth in petroleum. But the consumption and the production not really impaired. The production is less than the consumption by a little, but still very expensive for the country to buy outside energy, obviously. That's what we see right here. Consumption, this is 2006 probably. Consumption here, production, but now this thing is going like it happened in Mexico. YPF dominated all exploration and production, even more now that it is back to be nationalized. So the Argentina oil, the oil company YPF, was nationalized, a national company, and then was privatized. And now again, it's nationalized. So, you know, they don't make their mind. The main basins are marking here, Noroeste, Guyana, or Neuquén, together we can put it, San Jorge Basin and Austral Basin, those are the main ones. All of them are onshore basins. There's some potential offshore, but they never really make anything. So it's not production from offshore. Colombia is producing coal, interestingly enough. It does very large production, more than the consumption. It's the third largest oil producer after Venezuela and Brazil, so it's important. And we see here production is quite larger than consumption. So all this is revenue that can be acquired for the country, because in Colombia also Ecopetrol, that's the name, is a national company. Ecuador is actually the fifth largest producer in South America and Latin America. It's not really a big country. It's smaller than Nevada. Obviously, tropical climate. It's in the equatorial line. Happens to be right. Where is it? Not sure, but I think it's more or less through here. The latitude, the zero latitude. Ecuador is producing more than what they use, so even it happens not to be too much, it does make a good revenue for the country. Most of the reserves in Ecuador are in the Oriente Basin. Let me just mark it. It's over here in this area, in the Amazon jungle, which is a very controversial issue because it happened to be a big pollution event there. So that is more or less what we have all about the main countries in Latin America. We're going to go a little over a new resource, what is called the non-conventionals, in particular the shale gas and shale oil. That happen to be the one that make big changes in the reserves and production of the United States. So if we look into the reserves of these unconventional shale oils, we see here conventional is this one. Venezuela is the first, Canada, United States, Brazil. So these two are normally what is the typical oil. Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, and Ecuador. And then we took into evaluating the produced by shale oil only. And this is what we see in the big production of the United States now. Shale oil is producing a lot more now, that about double that is producing conventional reservoirs. Venezuela a little, not really been explored much. Canada a little, Mexico a little, and Argentina seems to be potentially very rich in those unconventional shale oils. The amount of gas that can be recovered in unconventional shales, shale gas if you want, in particular in Argentina, it can be produced in about 20 billion barrels of shale oil and 583 trillion cubic meters of shale gas. This is the second potential reserve of gas in the world. As we mentioned in the previous lecture, the first one is China. The second one happens to be Argentina with this Vaca Muerta reservoir. So we'll see. Venezuela, without question, the most important reserves in the world. Mexico, declining without investment. Colombia, healthy production. And Brazil, making a lot with little, really, because they go into places where nobody goes to extract hydrocarbon resources. So that's more or less all we have. So Latin America is also very important in the production of hydrocarbons and in particular important for themselves. So we see here Brazil making a big difference by using those basins in the offshore remain. Argentina with a big potential that is waiting to happen, and Venezuela ignoring the resource for political reasons, obviously, happen to be under sanctions and with a government that happen to be in an interesting trajectory. And Mexico, that is still is also not really investing as they should in a pair with Argentina, more or less. And Colombia keeping up on the good work, more or less. All right, so next time we're going to talk about lithium. We're going to talk about renewable energies and the importance of lithium as a resource. All right, thank you very much.